Hey guys, week 13. As I was starting this video, it was raining and now it's perfectly sunny out, so it's another typical Florida Saturday, I suppose. But anyway, yeah, let's get into week 13. So before we get started though, thank you for your reflections on silence. I had a really good time reading through the discussion this past week. Some really interesting takes. A lot of you are kind of agitated and frustrated by it, which I think is Endo's goal, first of all. But also, it's the main disagreement for a lot of people who read silence. The main disagreement is does Rodriguez do the right thing? Does he honor Jesus by acting on behalf of the Japanese Christians, or does the fact that he does, even if it's just a formality, he does go through the action of renouncing Christ and putting his foot on the fumi? Is there a way back from that? And it's kind of a split decision. Some people say yes, he is honoring Jesus in the way, even though even though he feels that the statute tells him to go ahead and trample. That some people say that that's enough. Where he is, he legitimately did hear from Jesus. Jesus told him to trample, so he goes ahead and trample because he's doing what Jesus would have him do: act sacrificially on behalf of the other. We talked about redemptive suffering and how victory comes from defeat in a lot of ways, and this is a defeat for Rodriguez, but it's a defeat on behalf of others. And that's the type of stuff that is oftentimes in the Christian faith presented as redemptive. And some people say, no, that was not truly Jesus who spoke to him. That was his own conscience trying to make him feel better. That was something else. And he should have held on, even though he heard the other Christians suffering, even though he knew what was going on. The fact that he did go ahead and place his foot on that image and go ahead and go through what was expected in terms of apostatizing, that the ending is tainted, that he is no longer in step with what Jesus would have him do. And it's not, so basically, and how you answer that question determines whether you believe that silence ends well or doesn't, or ends happily or ends not so happily. I mentioned this before in chapter 10, that last chapter. It's really obscure, but you do have in chapter 10 evidence that even after stepping on the fumi, even after this whole process, he is apostate Paul now. He has a Japanese wife and a Japanese family, Japanese job. But chapter 10, in a really obscure way, I mean, going through financial records or whatever it is, seems to indicate that there is a house church, there is an underground movement that is still there, even if it's not officially connected to anything, even if they can't count on support from any foreign countries or whatever, there is still something there. So, I don't know, it's an interesting question. It's not a question that can be answered easily, which for really good novels is usually the point. They don't want it to be wrapped up in a bow. They want you to chew on it and chew on it. It's one of the things I love about this novel. It's one of the reasons I assign it. So I hope it provided the same for you. I hope you weren't too agitated by the ending, although some of you kind of were, I noticed. But anyway, yeah, it might be a little bit unusual for an Intro to Christianity class to look for a work of fiction, but that one really allows us to get into a lot of really interesting things. So I hope it was worthwhile. A number of people noted that it's not the fastest novel. It takes a while to get into. A lot of historical fiction, I think, does that, where it's like, you know what, we need to set the scene and build the exposition before we move into the plot proper. But I think this is one of those books where it takes a while, but once it has you, and it hooks you in. So hope you enjoyed it. Hope it was worthwhile. Hope you learned something from it. So let's move ahead. We're moving on, but before we move on, there is a quiz that is open on Canvas, since I didn't get it up until today, which is Saturday. It is due next Saturday. It's due 14th. Covering weeks 9, 10, 11, and 12. So basically the two church history lectures that we did. Remember the first one, we talked about martyrdom, the patristic period, the church fathers. Second one was mostly the Reformation. Those 2 weeks. And then the 2 weeks that we covered silence, they're going to be on this last quiz. All of the review sheets are up on the Files tab. You should have access to all of them. and yeah, it's basically, I'm not trying to trick you. It's basically the same format that it has been in terms of what to expect and what to look for. So if you have any questions preceding your taking of the quiz, obviously let me know. Otherwise, it's there for you. But we're going to shift gears. We've spent a lot of time dealing with stuff that happened hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Now it's time to shift gears, and now it's time to think about modern era, and to think about how Christianity does or doesn't get along with some of the elements of our modern era. And we're going to start by talking about modernity and how that works itself out. We are going to talk about I'm going to talk about stuff that happened a couple hundred years ago again, but by the end of it, it's going to get down to stuff that is happening even today. And some of the reading sources and the watching sources that I gave you are trying to work with that. So today, this week you have a selection from McGrath, which I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about here. But then you also have a lecture from Francis Collins that was first delivered in the year 2010. So not in the distant history, although I feel 8 years almost feels like it is sometimes. Francis Collins is a world-renowned geneticist, world-renowned scientist, also a very fervent Christian. And his whole project lately, he ran the Human Genome Project, just to give you a sense of his scientific credentials, but his whole project lately has been, how do you reconcile being a serious scientist with a Christian? How does that work? Now, that might be, for some people, it might be, is this even a question? Or for some people, you might be going, yeah, how does that work? Because a lot of times, especially the more fundamentalist branches of Christianity are oftentimes cited as being quote-unquote anti-science. How does science, which is achieved through human reason and human ingenuity and human discovery, how does it jive with divine revelation? It's a complicated question. It's a question that's still being asked to this day. Collins is one who addresses that head on, has a very interesting take. And then the other thing is just a really quick Guardian article on Catherine Hayhoe. Fun name. But she is another one who is a Christian, an evangelical Christian, but she's a climate scientist. And when it comes to climate change, that's an issue that a lot of Christians have been really slow to get on that train, or even they have not gotten on that train at all. And her project is trying to convince Christians to get on that train and to acknowledge anthropocentric climate change. To acknowledge the fact that we have really done a fantastic job of causing a lot of havoc when it comes to climate patterns, when it comes to all of these different issues. Again, a lot of particularly evangelical and fundamentalist branches of the Christian religion in the United States have no interest in this type of discussion. So she's another one who's going to try to incorporate science, the prevailing opinions of science, with faith, and how do those things measure up? How well do they dance together? Do they make good dance partners, or do they not? That's kind of the idea. That's where we're headed. So let me back up though. We get out of silence. Silence shows the missionary impulse. The missionary impulse drove people from Western nations primarily to go all over the world. Silence as Portuguese missionaries going to Japan. We could talk about the 1900s were just an unbelievable time of missionary activity. You could talk about so many of the big, Adoniram Judson. You could talk about a lot of different. There was a lot of missionary energy. A lot of energy that said we need to go to all the outer parts of the world, parts unknown. We need to present the gospel, present the religion to these people who might not otherwise have heard it, to save their souls from eternal perdition. As this was happening, however, the foundation back home, the foundation of Christianity in the Western world, in Europe, and then in the United States, although to a lesser degree, the United States as well, was weakening. There was an internal skepticism, internal rot going on, if you will. So even as the missionary impulse was leading Christians all the way around the world to try to convert others and other nations to the religion, back home, back in the strongholds of the religion, things were getting a little bit dicey. Why were they getting dicey? Well, it starts, with the Reformation. This is a broad sketch, obviously. But with the Reformation, you have denominations. We talked about this before. how this leads to religious wars, Catholics killing Protestants, Protestants killing Catholics, everyone killing Anabaptists. You have a lot of religious-based conflict. Europe eventually reaches a point where it says enough with the killing each other, not just over different religions, but different denominations within the same religion. Enough of this, please. We need tolerance, and there's kind of a collective. All right, why don't we move towards more of a position of you be this, I be that, and then we learn to coexist together. And this is not something that happens overnight, actually, obviously, but this is just the general move that starts to happen. And you see it in a lot of the most famous philosophers of the time. For example, John Locke. McGrath talks a lot about him. Locke is writing. He is following up on the work of Thomas Hobbes, who is probably the first great modern political philosopher in a lot of ways. But Locke is following up on his because he's talking about contract, he's talking about the social contract, state of nature, that type of stuff. But he takes it further. He is writing immediately on the heels of the Glorious Revolution in England. His letter concerning toleration came out in 1689, which is almost immediately after the Glorious Revolution in England. He is an Enlightenment philosopher. He is the father of American philosophy in a lot of, not philosophy in terms of American philosophers, but from a philosophical perspective, John Locke is the father of the American nation. There would be no Thomas Jefferson Declaration of Independence without John. He's basically aping John Locke in a lot of ways. Jefferson was heavily influenced by Locke. A lot of other American revolutionaries were too. And what really stuck with them, a lot of them, was this language about toleration. So here's what Locke had to say, and it's in your McGrath. I've given the page number in the notes. He says, the state is not equipped to adjudicate competing religious claims. Therefore, the state is not equipped to take Catholics over here, Protestants over here, and say, we side with these people. The rest of you need to either get in line or get out. The state does not have the machinery to do that, and to do that in any sort of just way. So it can't, because it's not, you're talking about political leaders. You're not talking about religious leaders. It's not a theocracy. So the state doesn't have the machinery to adjudicate competing religious claims. Even if it could, the state could not compel adherence to a religious tradition. Locke's ideal is not going to be we are Catholics and that's all there is to it. And if you don't like it, you can bugger off and go somewhere else. You can't force people to believe something, and if you try, the results are going to be disaster. So this is the foundations of, tolerance is obviously something that's very important today. You see the coexist bumper sticker all over the place. It's a word you hear a lot. This is kind of the birth of it in a lot of ways, because Locke is saying, you know what? There is an argument to be made for live and let live, and these states that try to compel religious tradition and try to compel obedience, try to compel belief, it's not going to work. So this is a lot of ways the birth of religious tolerance. What it also is the birth of the public religion, private religion split. Because before, kings and leaders of countries had absolutely zero problem compelling adherence to a religious tradition. I'm Catholic, therefore the rest of you will be Catholic. I'm Lutheran, therefore the rest of you will be Lutheran, and if you don't like it, you can bugger off and go somewhere else, or we can just kill you, your choice. That was extremely common. But with Locke, there's this movement to say, no, that's absolutely, that just produces more of the killing, and we're tired of the killing. Can we go in a different direction, please? Therefore, I can have my private religious convictions, you can have yours, and maybe we can live together and not kill each other. Sound like a good idea? So that's kind of where it's going. But what happens, though, when revelation, however it's perceived, gets replaced? Because before it was, all right, we're going to be governed by the tenets of basically the religious tradition of the rulers. But what are we being governed by now? If we're dismissing religion from being able to fuel political realities in this way, and we're trying to do more in the name of tolerance, then what is going to be ultimately, what's going to be the fuel that powers the engine? And what that fuel turned out to be was human reason. So you have these exhaustion over religious wars, but at the same time, you have the rise of the Enlightenment and the age of reason. So again, what happens is this serves to push, in a lot of ways, serves to push religious commitment more and more to the side, more and more as a private expression of devotion, rather than as the material to run a country. In the age of reason, obviously, as the name implies, elevates human reason above all else. What is the adjudicating factor? What is the adjudicating claim? It's not divine revelation as we understand it. It's our ability to reason. It's our ability to use our brains to figure things out, to make a better world for ourselves. So reason begins to take the dominant spot, and reason begins to try to explain religion. You might have seen this parable before, the parable of the blind men and the elephants, a famous parable, where you have three different blind men approach an elephant. One of them touches one of the rear legs and says, "Oh, wow, it's a trunk." One of them touches the tail and goes, "Oh, wow, it's a fan." One of them touches one of the ears and says, "Oh, wow, it's a fan." Another one touches the I don't even know, maybe the side of the body. I don't remember now. And says, "Oh, it's something else." But the character we don't meet in that story, but the most important character is the narrator, the one telling the story, because the implication is the narrator can see the entire elephant and can explain what it is. Whereas these poor, benighted religious people are only seeing one aspect of the elephant and calling it something else. So what this parable is often used for is tolerance. What its point is to say, all right, say the guy who touches the back leg and calls it a trunk is a Christian. Say a guy who touches the fan or touches the ear and calls it a fan is a Muslim or Hindu or something else. The point is they're all grasping towards the same thing. They all see it imperfectly. They all only get a piece of it. Whereas the narrator, who kind of represents reason in this scenario, can see the whole thing for exactly what it is. So in other words, the Enlightenment view is, you know what all you religious people need? You need someone to come explain all this to you. And this, enter the rational philosopher and later the scientist. Human reason can figure anything out, especially religious impulse. Let the religious people play their little religious games, but we're the ones who are doing real work. We're the ones who are really figuring out how the world works. We're not interested in fairy tales and stories. We're trying to get empirical proof about the way in which the world works on a physical level with science, but also on a political level with social science. This is what we're trying to do. So religion, including Christianity, goes from being the driving force of society. I mean, think about the medieval period. The church was the driving force in society. It goes to more of a individualized, privatized devotion that was best not brought forward in certain company. Whereas the faith, ironically enough, the faith was placed in human reason, the ability for humans to work together and to solve problems without dragging in religious superstitions that make us want to murder each other into it. Yeah, that's a really broad generalization, but I do think there's merit to it, where this is the movement of the Enlightenment going into the modern era. It's going, we need a different scale to keep from letting these superstitions ruin our lives and letting us kill each other. What's it going to be? It's going to be our ability to reason. It's going to be our ability to figure things out. Now, we talked about Aquinas before. It's not that reason is antithetical to the Christian belief. We talked about Aquinas and how he incorporates reason into his natural law. But what's happening here is if you're dealing with reason and revelation, which one is taking the dominant position? For Aquinas, revelation took the dominant. There was definitely a place for reason, an important place, but revelation took the dominant position. Now it's flipped. Reason is taking the dominant position, and revelation is definitely the more secondary. If that gives you meaning in your interior private life, awesome. Just leave it there and don't bring it out in polite society. Thank you very much. So that's kind of what's happening here. Meanwhile, you see the way in which religion is interacting. It's coming into the modern era in other ways. America is a little bit different than Europe in the way in which it does it. There's a little bit of a different vibe here, and there's a reason even now that religious commitment has hung on in America much far longer than it has in Europe, although signs seem to be pointing to the end of it here in this country as well, or at least the diminishment of it. But in America we talked about this earlier, how Americans saw Church of England as the extension of English rule. So the politics and the religion were very closely married together. So they said, we want democracy, and in our democracy, we want religious freedom as well. And this is the birth of the idea of the separation of church and state, going, you know what, we need to let people have the ability to believe what they want to believe and not be shackled by a state religion of any kind. State religion puts a burden on the individual conscience and the freedom of a Christian who wants to believe differently. It also produces a church that is compromised and weak-willed and half-hearted. So let the pure gospel church live, down with a compromised state church. This is where, when you talk about separation of church and state, and the original phrase was a wall of separation. What was going on here was, how do we, the social order versus the liberty of conscience. What's significant about the doctrine of separation of church and state is that it's been flipped. Its original purpose was to protect the church and not the state. Roger Williams, one of the first pioneer explorers of America, his line was, the wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. In other words, don't let the nastiness and the wildness of politics get into the church and make the church corrupt and weak-willed and half-hearted. So the separation of church and state in Roger Williams' mind is to protect the religious conscience, but also to protect the purity of the church. This is also the line that Jefferson follows, and this is so oftentimes gets lost. Jefferson is interested in the ability of the religious conscience to exercise their commitments freely. Again, it's not that we want to keep the theocrats from messing with American democracy. It's we want to keep the power brokers and the political leaders from America from making American religious people bend their conscience in directions that they don't want it to go. So the original impetus of the separation of church and state was not to protect the state from the church. It was to protect the church from the state. Protect Christian believers from the power of a state that might compel them to believe in a certain way. That's almost been entirely flipped on its head nowadays. And if you ask most people what the separation of church and state is all about, they're going to say it is in order to protect American democracy from the machinations of potential theocrats, people who want political power to be alongside their theological authority. Or maybe put that a better way, who want their theological authority to produce for them political power. So it's been flipped on its head in a lot of ways, because the doctrine is now widely believed to protect people from religion, whereas in the past it was articulated specifically to protect Christians from the impulses of a government, which, as they understood very well, was all too accustomed to overreach. So it's just interesting to see the way that's gone. But this is the beginning of the modern age. This is, again, that separation. Whereas in the medieval period, they were like this. You see that separation, and you see that public-private, dominant, submissive type of relationship start to form between religious belief and political power. And not just political power, but just the way in which faith was traditionally understood. You have, with the advent of democracy, ironically enough, because I asked you a few weeks back about America as a Christian nation, but ironically enough, with the advent of democracy, you have distrust in the old religion and the old religious structures, and much more of an impulse to say, you can believe what you want, I can believe what I want, but let's settle our political discussions and disputes regardless of our theological beliefs. Let's leave those to the private life, to the private sector. And what happens is they end up getting marginalized. They end up getting privatized, marginalized faith soon becomes no faith at all. And it's interesting because the missionary impulse really goes on. It may be too strong a language, but the missionary impulse saves the faith in some ways. It was interesting. I saw something many, many years ago that said in the 20th century, you saw a flip. Because before the 20th century, and even in the early parts of the 20th century, the vast majority of the missionaries were going from quote-unquote Christian nations to non-Christian nations. So they were going from America and Western Europe to the east, to places like India and China and so on and so forth. But according to this source, and I can't remember it now, but there was a shift that happened. It was the opposite, where the opposite started to occur, where more and more missionaries from Africa and South America and other places were going to America, were going to Western Europe with the, because that became the mission field. The mission field was no longer, let's go to India and try to reach the, the quote-unquote heathens. It was Indian missionaries saying, we've got to go to London. Or Brazilian missionaries saying, we've got to go to America because that is where the non-believers are now. It's a fascinating connection. So the church, the church really, in a lot of ways, the church struggles in the modern age. They have to figure out how to reconcile old beliefs with new challenges, and McGrath lists a bunch, and I would definitely commend page 178 of McGrath to you because it's very, very helpful. He talks about the Industrial Revolution, how Christianity flourished in agricultural, in the agricultural society, but now it's not agricultural anymore. The society is moving in a more industrial direction, more urban direction. How does Christianity reconcile with that? McGrath talks about the rise of biblical criticism. Again, smart philosophers and scholars explaining away religious impulse, and a huge target for them is the scriptures. So you have something called biblical criticism, higher criticism. It's been labeled with lots of names, but what it used to be, here's the short version. Before the onset of biblical criticism, the Bible was studied, of course, but it was studied, I don't want to say in good faith, but it was studied as it was believed. But with the rise of biblical criticism, you have something which Nietzsche actually called the hermeneutic squint, where you look at it, where you're studying something, you look at it, you assume it is problematic, you assume it's full of holes, and your job is to go find them and to go explore it and to go, figure out what's going on. You view everything with suspicion. The hermeneutic squint says, take your source with suspicion. Whereas before, the Bible was studied, but it was studied by someone who was a believer, so they're not going to be suspicious of it. But now, in this period, it becomes if you're studying the New Testament, okay, be very skeptical about the things that Jesus actually said versus what he didn't actually say. Or if you're studying the Old Testament, the old view that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament, well, that's preposterous. We're going to come up with a documentary hypothesis to try to explain who actually wrote these books of the Bible. You have the Darwinian revolution. You have the advent of modern science, and this might be the stiffest challenge of all. This is what we're going to talk about here in a little bit. Or Darwin. And it's interesting because it wasn't always this way. Darwin was embraced by a lot of leaders in the Christian community. And his principles, if you read even some of the old stuff, in the late 19th, even early 20th centuries, a lot of Christian leaders loved Darwin. But then you had the shift that starts to happen where he starts to be seen as threatening, starts to be seen as someone who is a challenge. And this is where, I talked a little bit about Francis Collins and Catherine Hayhoe. This is where they're situated because they are still believers. Collins, I mentioned, Human Genome Project, Hayhoe, climate scientists, both Christians attempting to integrate reason and revelation. So if reason and revelation are doing this, these two scientists are attempting to integrate them, to bring them back together. How do you do that? Both of them challenge the idea that reason assumes atheism. Because what ultimately the modern project was how can we come up with a system that explains everything, including religious impulse, including religious devotion, including religious teaching. Both of these, Collins and Hayhoe, are going to say, no, there is a line. Science can do a lot, and science has proven to be an extremely powerful tool in the hands of human beings. But there is a barrier. There is a line beyond which science is ill-equipped to handle. And that is, to put it another way, there are questions that science is designed to answer, and then there are questions which religion / philosophy / these other disciplines are designed to answer. And a common problem nowadays is when people assume that science can cover all the bases. The technical term for that is scientism, and you see that everywhere. Where you have, and the classic expression is like a Dawkins or Daniel Dennett or somebody like that. that assumes that science has it. Science can even explain. Science can explain religious belief. It can explain basically everything. Whereas someone like Collins and Hayhoe both are going to say, no, there's things that science is not equipped to deal with, not equipped to handle. Stephen Jay Gould, the great evolutionary biologist, referred to this kind of perspective as non-overlapping magisteria. In other words, reason is in charge of its world, religion is in charge of its world, and they both have jurisdiction over their own worlds, and they don't overlap. So keep the stuff that science has jurisdiction over here, and the stuff that religion has jurisdiction over here, and all will be right with the world. The big question is that even possible? And it's an open question. It's by no means has been solved. So you have different perspectives on this issue. Fundamentalism says no, this is not possible. Clashes with progressive Christians. You have the Scopes trial, which is a key moment. And if you don't know what the Scopes trial is, go research it, because you need to know. It's a fundamental moment. Clarence Darrow, William Jennings Bryan, teacher in Tennessee, gets basically brought into court for teaching evolution. And the fundamentalist side is represented by William Jennings Bryan, and he is torn apart in court. And even though the teacher who taught evolution is technically found guilty, in the court of public opinion, evolution and the atheism that was often connected with that just slaughters fundamentalist Christianity. H.L. Mencken is a reporter at these trials, and the stuff that he writes, I mean, it becomes a key moment, a watershed. So the momentum is with secularization. Post-Christian society starts to become a real thing. How do Christians deal with this? Well, we talked a little bit about, or we didn't talk about it, it was in the reading. One of the ways in which the Catholic Church tried to deal with this is through Vatican II, the big council that was happening in the early to mid-60s. They had a term there called aggiornamento, which is an Italian term, basically being bringing up to date. We will not be in the ghetto, we will dialogue, we will try to connect with a lot of these issues. So the church finds itself in a very difficult position in the modern era. There is one point of irony, though, that I will mention. The modern era partially begins as a response to religious bloodshed, all these religious people killing each other. But by the end of the 20th century, you have a century that produces more bloodshed than all the previous eras combined. And atheism is responsible for a lot of it. Not all of it. Christian impulses and other religious impulses are responsible for it as well. But they said, all right, religious people are killing each other. Let's go through this process of privatizing and ultimately marginalizing religion, and come to find out they're still killing each other. Isn't that interesting? Anyway. So then, you have, in the modern era, you also have Christianity dealing with Marxism, a competing ideology within Christianity, dealing with nationalism. There's so many things that are all kind of swirling around at once, where you're dealing with nationalist power, nationalist tendencies, Marxist tendencies, and the church is in a lot of ways stuck in the middle of a lot of flowing currents happening all at the same time. They're going, how in the world are we doing this? And there's a lot of different responses. The more fundamentalist Christians say we're going to withdraw from public life. We're going to build our kingdom, kind of an Anabaptist-ish approach. We're going to withdraw. We're going to build our kingdoms over here. Let the world go do what the world does. There are others who say, no, we need to engage with all these things. We need to embrace the good of these things and engage with the bad. There's a whole lot. I would commend a book to you. There was a book, Richard Niebuhr. The Niebuhr brothers, Reinhold and Richard, were famous theologians, mid-20th century theologians. Richard was lesser known than his brother Reinhold, but he wrote a book called Christ and Culture, which had 5 different types for ways in which Christians could engage with the prevalent culture that was around them. It was written in 1951. Even though it is an old book, it's still fascinating, worth reading, because it gave a lot of interesting pictures for how Christians during this time period were wrestling with how do we engage, what do we do? And he looked at some some elements of Christian religion that were like, let's withdraw, let's pull back. He looked at others that said, let's go engage so much with the world that their Christian distinctiveness got lost. And he had other points in between as well. It's well worth reading. It's really interesting. But let me just end by talking a little bit about some of the ways in which the church successfully navigates the waters in the modern era. And one big one is the civil rights movement. Churches coming into the public life. There would be no civil rights movement without the black church. So this is one element where there is public Christianity working for good. You have Pope John Paul II, the fall of the Soviet Union, another one. But at least in the post-Christian West, these elements are becoming harder to come by, and that's especially true today. Whereas in other parts of the world, you have a lot more vitality. We could talk about liberation theology. We could talk about globalization. We could talk about a lot of things that are happening in other parts of the world. We could talk about Pope Francis being a pope. A pope coming from this part of the world, this South American pope. That would have been unheard of not too long ago. All the popes came from Europe. But now we have, you have basically, long story short, the center of power, the center of vitality when it came to Christianity for the longest time was Western Europe and America. We now live in an age where that is not true, where those areas are more post-Christian than anything else. The vitality lies elsewhere. It's the south of here. It's the east of here. It's an interesting time. And in these parts of the world, Christianity struggles to try to deal with the rapid changes that are happening. But in other places, there is strength and there is vitality. So it makes for an interesting mix. So anyway, kind of a huge topic, and this is just the most briefest introduction imaginable, and I've already gone on too long. But watch the video, read the article, and think about how these two scientists are trying to wrestle with reason and revelation, how they're trying to bring them together and integrate them, and ask, is that a project that's even possible? And we will continue dealing with some of these more modern questions next week.